It's an honor to be here sharing God's word with you today, and I want to thank my sisters for asking me to do this, and thank Ralph for getting things well, actually it took a village. Linda and Ralph and Donna and John Paul, and so the village gathered around me and we got this done. Please forgive me, I have some neuropathy issues, and so I am going to sit down to preach, and I hope that will be all right. Thank you. God has created each of us in God's image, and we are all called for a purpose, which helps to give meaning to our lives and the lives of others. Even people we would never expect have a purpose. Purpose can be found sometimes even in people who are unaware that they have a purpose. Last week, we focused on purpose and calling by looking at the call of Moses. This week, I'm going to talk about how God can use any and all of us to make people aware of a purpose and possible calling by recognizing and encouraging them in their gifts and graces, or by helping them to see opportunities where their gifts and graces could shine. Maybe they're already in a good position to share their gifts and graces, but they just don't realize it yet. Let's look at the story of Esther, a young woman who was raised to an unexpected position which should have put her in the lap of luxury for the rest of her life, but instead called her to risk her life to save her people. In the land of the Medes and the Persians, there reigned a king whose name was Ahasuerus. Perhaps you might know him better as Xerxes or Artaxerxes. Ahasuerus is my favorite of the names. It is a hard name to say, but it's kind of fun to say it. He reigned over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia, and lived in the capital city or fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of this king's reign, he held a banquet for his officials, nobles, and governors, which lasted 180 days. When this celebration was completed, he held another banquet for all the men of Susa, which lasted for 7 days. His queen also held a banquet for the women. On the 7th evening, when the king was what polite society might call merry with wine, he ordered the 7 eunuchs who attended him to get the queen from the women's banquet and bring her out with the royal crown on her head so that all the men might see her beauty. When they got to the queen with the king's order, she did a most unheard of thing. She refused to go. So the queen was demoted and a new one was sought. A proposal was made that young ladies from throughout the kingdom should be gathered and brought for beauty treatments and training, and each one taken individually to spend time with the king. The one who delighted him most would be his new queen. Now, there was a young lady among the Jews living in Susa. Her parents had died while she was still a child, and her cousin Mordecai had adopted her and raised her as his daughter. Her given Hebrew name was Hadassah, Her Persian name was Esther. In the movie Esther, it said that the name Esther means hidden. I did not find that when I looked for the meaning of her name, but that possibility is important to the story. In the movie, her cousin Mordecai told her that she would be called Esther, and she knew what that meant because he had told her not to reveal her ethnicity during the process. She waited for the right time to reveal who she really was. She was one of the young ladies taken for what I'll call the King's Grand Beauty Contest. Preparations for meeting with the king consisted of 6 months of treatments with cosmetic oils and 6 months of cosmetic perfume treatments. Oh, I liked that one. Then they were ready to meet the king. Each young lady could take whatever she desired from the harem with her to meet with the king. When it was Esther's turn, she said she would take with her whatever the eunuch in charge of the women advised. Every day of her year of preparation, Mordecai stood outside the harem and inquired about Esther's welfare and how she was getting along. When she went to see the king, he was so delighted with her that he placed the royal crown upon her head and made her his queen. He celebrated her with all his officials at a banquet, Esther's banquet. Sometime later, Mordecai was at the king's gate, and he heard 2 of the king's eunuchs who were in charge of entrance to the palace. They had become angry with the king and were plotting his assassination. Mordecai reported this to Queen Esther, who reported it to the king in Mordecai's name. When the report was investigated and found to be true, the eunuchs were put to death. Soon after that, an official named Haman was promoted to highest official in the kingdom. All were commanded to bow to him and give him deferential respect, as they would to the king. Day after day, as Mordecai stood outside the palace, he did not bow or give such respect to Haman. It wasn't that he disrespected Haman, but he didn't worship him or the king as gods. In those days, kings in the land to where the Jews had been exiled were seen and bowed down to as gods, and they expected it. You may recall the stories of Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Day after day, Mordecai was asked by the officials at the gate why he didn't do for Haman as the king had commanded. Mordecai explained his position, letting them know that he was a Jew. When this was reported to Haman, Haman was angry and set out not just to destroy the Jews, or to destroy Mordecai, but to destroy all the Jews in the entire kingdom. Haman told the king that there was a people scattered through all his provinces who did not follow the king's laws, and that it was not in the best interests of the king to tolerate them. So if it was all right with the king, and if he could have the money and permission to do so, he would have the Jews destroyed and would put 10,000 talents, for which I found the equivalency to range from 375 tons of silver to billions of dollars, into the king's treasuries. The king told him to keep his money, and permission was granted. The edict was written and signed with the king's signet ring and sent around the kingdom. Mordecai found out about it and went through the entire city wailing bitterly. He sat at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes. This was reported to Queen Esther, who sent out clothes for him to put on, but he would not accept them. So she sent her attending eunuch out to find out what was troubling him. Mordecai explained everything to the eunuch and gave him a copy of the edict for him to show and explain to Esther, and a message which charged her to go to the king and plead for the sparing of her people. She sent a message back to Mordecai saying that it was well known throughout the palace that anyone who went to the king, including the queen, without being asked for, could be put to death. But if he happened to hold out his golden scepter to them, they would live and be allowed to state their petition. Reality suddenly hit this young woman, hard and fast. She was young. She had practically her whole life still ahead of her. Her cousin, who had raised her from childhood, who loved her and whom she loved, the one she had always obeyed and the one to whom she had always listened, was asking her to risk her life by going to the king on behalf of her people. But she wouldn't want to lose him and the people that she loved. She didn't know what to do. But Mordecai replied to her concern and said, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Esther messaged Mordecai once more, instructing him to get together with all the Jews in Susa to fast and pray for 3 days that the king would receive her and hear her petition, and she and her maids would do the same. She told him that the king had not asked for her for a month. She said that if she perished, she perished. When the 3 days were over, she went to the king, and when he saw her, he held out the golden scepter to her. She touched the top of the scepter, and he asked her what her petition was. She invited him and his highest official, Haman, to a banquet that she had prepared. They went to her banquet, but she did not share her petition. Instead, she invited them back to dine with her the following night and said that then she would share her petition. You might say that after the banquet, fate was at work, but I'd say that God was at work. The king had a case of insomnia, so he called for the book of records to be brought and for someone to read it to him. The reader read to him about how Mordecai had discovered a plot against his life. The king asked if anything had been done to honor Mordecai for saving his life. Nothing had been done. So he asked if anyone was in the court. It so happened that Haman was there, waiting to see the king. So the king invited him in and asked him what should be done for the man the king chose to honor. Supposing it to be himself, Haman threw out some ideas. The king told him to go and do everything he had mentioned for Mordecai. That was certainly a blow to Haman, because Haman had just built a gallows to hang Mordecai on for his refusal to bow to him and to give him the respect that he felt he deserved. But the king had ordered it, so he had to do it. That night, at Esther's banquet for the king and Haman, the king asked her for her request. She asked him for her life and to spare the lives of her people because they were set for destruction. She said if they were being sold as slaves, she would have held her peace, but they were being sold to be killed. The king asked who it was that was going to destroy her people, and she told him that it was Haman. The king was angry when he heard this and went out to the garden to cool off. Haman stayed in to beg for his life, falling down on the couch with Queen Esther as the king walked back in. Believing that Haman was trying to assault her, he had him hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. The king then sent for Mordecai because Esther had told him who he was to her, and the king promoted Mordecai to the position that Haman had occupied. The king took off his signet ring, which he had retrieved from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. Mordecai sent out an edict allowing the Jews to defend themselves if they were attacked. The enemies of the Jews were wiped out of the kingdom, and a celebration was established called Purim, or the Feast of Lots, because lots had been cast to determine the month and the date that the Jews would have been destroyed. People exchanged choice foods with one another and gave gifts. They also gave gifts to the poor. Purim is still practiced in Jerusalem and other cities in that area. There's a lot of violence in this story, but it was the courage, humility, and quiet strength of a young woman who risked her life and the high position she had been given without asking for it, to take a chance that her position could influence the king to reverse the plot to destroy the Jews scattered over the kingdom that stretched from India to Ethiopia. We don't always have to use force to have influence. We can do it with gentleness, respect, and grace. We live in a divided nation, a divided world, full of anger, hostility, and hate. Who knows? Maybe God is calling us to make peace, to show love, to heal divisions in such a time as this.